Ethan Carter drummed his fingers on the steering wheel as his luxury SUV sped down the empty country road. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a relentless heat that shimmered on the asphalt. He glanced at his watch and cursed under his breath. His meeting was in less than an hour, and this remote shortcut was supposed to save time. Suddenly, the car jolted. A loud thump-thump-thump broke the silence, and the vehicle lurched to one side. Ethan's grip tightened on the wheel as he eased the SUV to the shoulder of the road. Dust billowed up around him as the car came to a stop. "Perfect," he muttered sarcastically, stepping out into the sweltering heat. The air hit him like a furnace as he squinted down at the front tire. It was shredded beyond repair. Ethan groaned, tugging at the knot of his tie and loosening it. Pulling out his phone, he sighed when he saw the dreaded words, "No service." Frustration boiled in his chest as he pocketed the useless device. He knelt beside the flat tire, inspecting it with growing dismay. Ethan had never changed a tire in his life. In his world, there were always people to handle these kinds of problems: chauffeurs, assistants, roadside crews. Yet here he was, alone on an empty road, with no one to rely on but himself. His mind drifted back to a time long ago when he had been a young, struggling college student. Stranded on a rainy night, he'd watched car after car drive past without stopping to help. The bitter memory still lingered, a reminder of how the world could turn its back on the vulnerable. The sun beat down harder, making the pavement shimmer in the distance. He stood and scanned the horizon. There was no sign of civilization, just an endless stretch of road flanked by fields of tall grass. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a silhouette emerging on the horizon. At first, he thought it was a mirage, but as the figure moved closer, it became clear. It was a boy, no older than 14, wearing a faded t-shirt and scuffed sneakers. The boy approached with a steady stride, his expression curious but calm. "Hey, mister," he called out, stopping a few steps away. "Got trouble with your car?" Ethan hesitated. The boy's voice was friendly, but Ethan wasn't used to relying on strangers, especially not a kid. "Yeah," he replied, gesturing toward the flat tire. "Flat tire. I don't exactly know how to fix it." The boy nodded, stepping closer to inspect the damage. "I can fix it. My dad showed me how." He dropped to his knees and began looking for the tools. "You got a spare?" Ethan blinked, surprised at the boy's confidence. "Wait, you're serious?" The boy glanced up, smiling slightly. "Yeah, it's just a tire, mister. No big deal." Before Ethan could object, the boy had moved to the back of the SUV, opening the hatch to retrieve the spare tire and tools. Ethan stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do with his hands as the boy worked. In no time, the boy was loosening the lug nuts, the rhythmic clanking of the wrench filling the silence. "You're really doing this," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to the boy. The boy looked up briefly, sweat glistening on his brow. "Yeah, of course. You look like you could use the help." Ethan felt a strange mix of gratitude and unease. He wasn't used to people doing things for him without expecting something in return. When the job was done, the boy stood and wiped his hands on his jeans. "All set, mister. You're good to go." Ethan reached for his wallet, pulling out a few crisp bills. "Here, for your trouble. I really appreciate it." But the boy shook his head, stepping back. "Nah, I don't need that. Just wanted to help." Ethan frowned, holding the money out. "No, really. I insist." The boy smiled again, waving dismissively as he began to walk away. "Take care, mister. Good luck with wherever you're going." Ethan watched him disappear down the road, the cash still clutched in his hand. He climbed back into his SUV, but as he started the engine, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his chest. The boy's act of kindness, simple, unassuming, and genuine, felt foreign to him. As he drove away, the boy's figure grew smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror until it vanished completely. Yet, the memory of the encounter lingered, growing louder in Ethan's mind with each passing mile. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir inside him, a longing he couldn't quite name. It wasn't about the money or the inconvenience. It was something deeper, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He drove on, the meeting he had been rushing to all but forgotten. Ethan Carter sat at the head of his sleek dining table, a silent observer as his family moved through their nightly routines. The clink of utensils on fine china echoed in the spacious dining room, but the meal felt hollow. His wife, Sophia, was scrolling through her phone, barely glancing at the perfectly plated salmon in front of her. Their son, Aaron, a high school senior, wore earbuds and stared blankly at his tablet. Only his daughter, Emily, seemed present, her curious gaze flicking toward Ethan. "Dad," Emily said suddenly, breaking the silence, "you've been quiet all evening. Something on your mind?" Ethan hesitated, his fork poised mid-air. The image of the boy, the way he'd smiled so easily after refusing the money, flashed in his mind. Setting the fork down, Ethan leaned back in his chair. "There was a boy today," he said slowly. "Help me fix a flat tire on the side of the road." Aaron looked up briefly, pulling out one earbud. "A flat tire? Did you call someone?" "No," Ethan replied. "He just showed up out of nowhere and handled it. Refused to take any money for it, too." Sophia glanced up from her phone, an eyebrow raised. "A kid? Was it safe to let him help?" "People take advantage, Ethan." Ethan shook his head. "He wasn't like that. He didn't ask for anything, just helped and left." Emily tilted her head, intrigued. "So, what's the big deal?" Ethan frowned, searching for the right words. "It's not normal, I guess. No one does something like that anymore without expecting something in return." Aaron shrugged, returning to his tablet. Maybe he was just bored. Sophia chuckled lightly, sipping her wine. Or maybe he's angling for something bigger later. People always have motives. Emily frowned at her mother's words, but said nothing. Ethan pushed his plate away, his appetite gone. The conversation had only deepened the unease that had followed him home. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the master bedroom, his thoughts spinning. Why had the boy's actions unsettled him so much? It wasn't just the kindness. It was the quiet confidence, the genuine willingness to help without expectation. It made Ethan question everything he'd built his life around. He had grown up believing that nothing came without a price. Even his wealth and success had come at great cost. Sleepless nights, ruthless decisions, sacrifices of relationships and time. Was it possible that the boy, Isaiah, lived by a different set of rules? The next morning, over coffee, Ethan made up his mind. He needed to find Isaiah, not to repay him, but to understand him. "Where are you off to this early?" Sophia asked, eyeing him from behind her tablet as he grabbed his keys. "Back to the road where I had the flat," Ethan said simply. Sophia's brow furrowed. "Why?" "I need to find that boy," Ethan replied. "There's something I need to know." Sophia sighed, setting her tablet down. "Ethan, this is ridiculous. You don't owe him anything. Let it go." But Ethan shook his head. "It's not about owing him. It's something else." He left before she could argue further, the door closing softly behind him. The sun was already climbing high as Ethan drove back along the same rural road. His SUV rumbled along, the memory of yesterday's encounter sharp in his mind. The landscape looked different now, less barren, less hostile. He slowed as he approached the spot where his car had broken down. There was no sign of Isaiah, but a farmhouse stood in the distance, its weathered paint peeling and its front yard overgrown with weeds. Ethan parked on the shoulder and approached the house on foot. As he neared, he saw a woman hanging laundry on a frayed clothesline. She straightened, noticing him. Her face was worn but kind, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked, shielding her eyes from the sun. Ethan cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of himself. "I'm looking for a boy, maybe 14 or so. Helped me change a tire out here yesterday. I think he lives around here." The woman studied him for a moment before nodding. "That would be my son, Isaiah." Relief washed over Ethan. "Is he home?" She gestured toward the side of the house. "He's out back chopping wood. You're welcome to wait." Ethan thanked her and walked around the house, his polished shoes crunching on the dry grass. He found Isaiah swinging an axe with precision, splitting logs into neat halves. The boy looked up as Ethan approached, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Hey, mister," Isaiah said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You get another flat? Ethan chuckled despite himself. No, not this time. I wanted to find you. Say thank you properly. Isaiah leaned on the axe handle, his expression curious. Didn't I already say it was no big deal? You did, Ethan admitted. But it's a big deal to me. I don't understand why you do something like that without asking for anything in return. Isaiah shrugged. My mom always says, if you can help, you should. It's not about getting something back. It's just the right thing to do. Ethan stared at the boy, his chest tightening. Those words, so simple, yet so profound, cut through him like a blade. What about your mom? Ethan asked. Does she believe the same thing? Isaiah nodded. She works hard every day to keep us going. Says it doesn't matter how much or how little you have, you've still got something to give. Ethan glanced at the farmhouse, its sagging roof and cracked windows telling a story of struggle. Yet, there was no bitterness in Isaiah's voice, no trace of resentment. Before he could think better of it, Ethan asked, Do you mind if I talk to her? Isaiah tilted his head, studying him for a moment, then nodded. Sure, come on. As they walked back toward the house, Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions. Curiosity, guilt, and something he hadn't felt in years, humility. Ethan followed Isaiah into the farmhouse, the screen door creaking on its hinges as they entered. The inside was modest, with faded wallpaper and well-worn furniture that bore the marks of years of use. Yet, the space felt warm and lived in, filled with small, personal touches. A crocheted blanket on the couch, family photos on the walls, and the faint scent of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen. Isaiah's mother, Miriam, stood at the counter, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough. She glanced up as they entered, her brow furrowing slightly at the sight of Ethan in his tailored suit. Mom, this is the guy I told you about, the one with the flat tire, Isaiah said, pulling out a chair at the small dining table for Ethan. Miriam wiped her hands on her apron and extended one toward Ethan. I'm Miriam. Nice to meet you. Ethan shook her hand, surprised by the firm grip. Ethan Carter. Thank you for letting me stop by. Miriam gestured toward the table, her tone polite but guarded. Can I get you some water? It's hot out there. Water would be great, thank you, Ethan replied, sitting down. Isaiah leaned against the counter, watching his mother with an easy familiarity. The way they interacted was subtle but telling, a quiet understanding between them, built on years of shared struggles. Miriam poured a glass of water and placed it in front of Ethan. Isaiah told me you tried to pay him yesterday, she said with a faint smile. He's stubborn about things like that. Ethan chuckled, taking a sip. He made that very clear. Miriam sat across from him, her eyes sharp as they studied him. Most people would have just taken the help and moved on. Why come back? The question caught Ethan off guard. He set the glass down, searching for the right words. I guess. I couldn't stop thinking about it. About Isaiah's kindness. It's not something I see often. Miriam nodded slowly, her expression softening. Kindness shouldn't be rare, but I suppose it feels that way sometimes. Ethan hesitated before asking, Is it just the two of you here? Miriam's smile faltered slightly. Yes. It's been that way for a while now. My husband passed years ago. Since then, it's been Isaiah and me holding things together. I'm sorry, Ethan said quietly. Miriam nodded, accepting the sentiment. We manage. It's not easy, but we get by. Isaiah helps a lot, even when I wish he'd just be a kid. Isaiah rolled his eyes playfully. I like helping. Miriam shot him a look, but her lips quirked into a small smile. You like meddling, more like? The exchange brought a warmth to the room, and for a moment, Ethan felt like an outsider looking in on a life he couldn't fully comprehend. As the conversation continued, Ethan learned more about their struggles. Miriam worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices during the day and waitressing at night. Isaiah took odd jobs around the neighborhood, from mowing lawns to stacking firewood. Their home, while filled with love, was in dire need of repairs. The roof leaked, the windows rattled in the wind, and the plumbing barely worked. Despite all of this, there was no bitterness in their voices, no sense of defeat. You said you get by, Ethan said carefully, But it sounds like a lot to deal with. Miriam shrugged. It is, but we don't dwell on it. There's always something to be grateful for. Ethan's gaze drifted to the window, where the cracked panes let in beams of sunlight. The disparity between their world and his own was stark. He thought of his sprawling, modern home, cold and impersonal in its perfection, and felt a pang of guilt. "Why didn't you take the money yesterday, Isaiah?" he asked suddenly, turning back to the boy. Isaiah shrugged. "We don't need handouts. Helping you wasn't about getting something back. It just felt like the right thing to do." Ethan nodded slowly, his chest tightening. Isaiah's answer was so simple, yet it carried a weight that unsettled him. As the afternoon stretched on, Ethan found himself reluctant to leave. Miriam eventually excused herself to finish her baking, and Isaiah led him outside to show him their backyard. "You don't come across many people like you," Ethan said as they walked. Isaiah tilted his head, looking up at him. "People are people, Mr. Carter. Maybe it's just about looking closer." Ethan smiled faintly, but the boy's words lingered. Isaiah spoke with a wisdom that belied his age, as if he'd learned to see the world differently because of what he'd lived through. The sound of a car pulling up to the house broke the moment. A beat-up truck came to a stop, and a heavy-set man climbed out, his expression sour. "Coopers!" the man barked, striding toward the porch. Isaiah stiffened beside Ethan, his demeanor darkening. "Who's that?" Ethan asked. "Marcus Reed," Isaiah muttered. "Our landlord." Marcus stomped up the steps, pounding on the doorframe. "Miriam, you're 3 days late on rent again." Miriam appeared at the door, her face calm but firm. "I told you I'd have it by the end of the week, Marcus. I just need a little more time." "You've had all the time in the world," Marcus snapped. "This ain't charity. If I don't have the money by Friday, you and your boy are out." Ethan stepped forward, his jaw tightening. "That's enough. She said she'll have it by the end of the week." Marcus turned to him, his lip curling. "And who are you? Another bleeding heart looking to play hero?" Ethan squared his shoulders. "I'm someone who doesn't take kindly to people throwing their weight around." Marcus scoffed but backed down, muttering something under his breath before returning to his truck. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle disappeared down the road. Miriam let out a breath, her hands trembling slightly as she leaned against the doorframe. "Sorry you had to see that," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "You shouldn't have to deal with someone like him." "It's the way things are," Miriam replied with a sad smile. "We just make do." Ethan stared at her, his unease growing into something sharper. It wasn't right. None of it was. For years, he had insulated himself from the injustices of the world, but now he couldn't look away. As he drove back home later that evening, Ethan felt a fire building in his chest. He had to do something, not just for Isaiah and Miriam, but for everyone forced to endure the unfairness of people like Marcus Reed. He wasn't sure how yet, but he knew this much. He wouldn't ignore it any longer. The drive back to the city was quiet, but Ethan's thoughts roared like a storm. The encounter with Marcus Reed stirred something deep within him, a potent mix of anger, guilt, and determination. It was more than just the boy, Isaiah, or his mother, Miriam. It was the unfairness of it all. Ethan had spent years climbing to the top, convinced that success justified every sacrifice. He had learned to navigate the cutthroat world of business, making decisions that often benefited the powerful while leaving others behind. For the first time, he wondered how many people like Miriam and Isaiah he had ignored or stepped over along the way. Back home, the house felt emptier than ever. The sprawling living room, with its designer furniture and glass walls overlooking the city skyline, seemed devoid of life. Ethan dropped his keys on the marble countertop and sank into the couch, staring out at the view without seeing it. Sophia's voice broke the silence. "So, did you find him?" Ethan looked up, startled to see her standing in the doorway. She was wearing one of her tailored blouses, her arms crossed. "I did," he said quietly. Sophia walked over and sat on the armchair across from him. And they're barely holding on," Ethan admitted. "Their house is falling apart, they're working themselves to the bone, and they have a landlord who's ready to kick them out." Sophia's expression softened for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "That's awful, Ethan. But what are you going to do?" Write them a check? That won't fix everything. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. It's not just about the money, Sophia. They need more than that. People like Marcus Reed. They thrive because no one stands up to them. Maybe I can change that. Sophia frowned. You've never been one to get involved in other people's problems. Why now? Ethan didn't have an answer that made sense, even to himself. Instead, he said, because it feels like the right thing to do. Sophia sighed and stood, brushing invisible lint from her pants. Just don't let this become some crusade, Ethan. You can't save the world. Maybe not, Ethan muttered as she walked away, but I can try. The next morning, Ethan began making calls. His assistant, Linda, was the first to notice something different. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice cautious, you've scheduled meetings with some unusual contacts. Are you sure you want to prioritize these over your regular agenda? Yes, Ethan replied firmly. Make it happen. He reached out to construction firms, legal experts, and community organizers. Each call was a step toward building something bigger than himself, though he wasn't entirely sure what it would become. Later that day, Ethan drove back to the Coopers' home, his mind racing with ideas. He arrived to find Isaiah in the yard, splitting wood again. The boy's face lit up when he saw Ethan pull up. Mr. Carter, Isaiah greeted him, setting the axe aside. Back already? Ethan smiled faintly. Call me Ethan. And yeah, I couldn't stay away. Isaiah grinned, wiping his hands on his jeans. You should come inside. Mom just made some tea. Inside, Miriam greeted him with the same polite warmth as before, though her eyes held a flicker of curiosity. You've come back, she said, pouring him a cup of tea. I didn't think we'd see you again so soon. Ethan took the cup, nodding. I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about making do, about kindness. And then I met Marcus Reed. That man, he trailed off, shaking his head. Miriam's mouth tightened into a thin line. Marcus owns half the properties around here. He knows people don't have many options, so he pushes them as far as he can. Isaiah chimed in, his tone sharp. He doesn't care about us. He just wants his money. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and steady. What if he didn't have that power anymore? What if someone stood up to him? Miriam's eyes narrowed. What are you saying, Ethan? I'm saying I want to help, Ethan said. Not just with your house, but with the whole situation. I have resources, money, connections. We could fight him, make things better for this community. Miriam shook her head slowly. It's not that simple. People have tried to push back before. They ended up worse off. Ethan met her gaze, determination flashing in his eyes. Then we'll try harder. This isn't just about you or Isaiah. It's about justice. People like Marcus shouldn't get away with this. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Miriam let out a long breath. If you're serious about this, you'll need more than just good intentions. You'll need the people on your side. Isaiah smiled faintly. And you'll need to get your hands dirty. Ethan chuckled softly. I'm starting to realize that. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Ethan returned to the Coopers' home with a team of contractors to assess the house. It was worse than he thought. Leaks in the roof, rotting floorboards, faulty wiring. Fixing it would take time, but Ethan was determined. However, Marcus Reed was not pleased. One afternoon, as Ethan oversaw the beginning of repairs, Marcus's truck screeched to a halt outside the house. He stormed out, his face red with anger. What the hell is this? Marcus bellowed. Ethan stepped forward calmly. Repairs. Marcus jabbed a finger at him. You're sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, Carter. These people owe me. You don't get to play hero and interfere. Ethan's jaw tightened. This isn't about playing hero. It's about doing what's right. Marcus sneered. You don't know how things work around here. Back off, or I'll make sure you regret it. Miriam appeared. Marcus Reed's threats hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. Ethan stood his ground, his jaw tightening as he met Marcus's glare. You've had your way here long enough, Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. These people deserve better, and I'm not backing down. Marcus chuckled bitterly. You think you're some savior? You don't belong here, Carter. This isn't your fight. Ethan stepped closer, his tone sharpening. You made it my fight when you decided to exploit these people. Now, get off this property. For a moment, Marcus looked like he might argue, but the workers gathering around the porch, tools in hand, seemed to give him pause. He spat on the ground, climbed back into his truck, and drove off, the tires kicking up dirt as he sped away. Miriam appeared at the door, her face pale. Ethan, what have you done? What needed to be done? Ethan replied, turning to face her. Miriam sighed, shaking her head. Marcus doesn't give up. He'll find a way to make us pay for this. Let him try, Ethan said. I'm not afraid of him. Isaiah, who had been watching from the porch steps, grinned. I don't think he's used to people standing up to him. Ethan smiled faintly, but his heart was heavy. He knew this was far from over. That night, Ethan worked late into the evening at his home office, reaching out to contacts who could help the community. He called lawyers, real estate experts, and local activists. He pored over contracts and property records, trying to understand the full scope of Marcus's influence. The more he learned, the angrier he became. Marcus wasn't just a greedy landlord. He had used legal loopholes and underhanded tactics to keep tenants trapped in cycles of debt and dependency. If anyone missed rent, he slapped them with excessive fees or threatened eviction. Ethan's own past came rushing back. He remembered the desperation he had felt as a young man, the humiliation of being dismissed by those who had the power to help but chose not to. This time, Ethan vowed it would be different. 2 days later, the first blow came. Early in the morning, Ethan arrived at the Cooper's house to find the front yard vandalized. Spray-painted insults covered the walls, and broken glass littered the ground. The repairs that had started on the roof were sabotaged, with materials scattered and ruined. Miriam stood on the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face unreadable. Isaiah was beside her, glaring at the mess. Marcus, Isaiah said bitterly. Ethan nodded, his hands curling into fists. It's a message. He wants us to back down. Miriam sighed, rubbing her temples. Maybe we should. This is just making things worse. No, Ethan said firmly. This is exactly what he wants, to scare us into giving up. If we stop now, nothing changes. Isaiah stepped forward, his eyes blazing with determination. He's right, Mom. We can't let him win. Miriam looked at her son, then back at Ethan. For a moment, she seemed torn. Then she nodded, her voice steady. Okay, we keep going. Ethan called the contractors back to the site, and they began cleaning up the damage. The workers' resolve seemed to harden in the face of Marcus's intimidation. Let's show that bastard he can't scare us, one of them muttered as he hauled debris away. As the day went on, Ethan made another call, this one to his legal team. I need everything you can find on Marcus Reed, he told his head lawyer, Karen Ortega. Property records, past disputes, tax filings, anything we can use. Karen was skeptical. You sure about this, Ethan? People like Marcus don't go down easy. That's why I'm calling you, Ethan said. I need someone who doesn't scare easily either. Karen chuckled dryly. All right, I'll see what I can dig up. The next few days were tense. Repairs on the Cooper's house continued, but Ethan could feel the weight of Marcus's looming presence. Every car that slowed near the property made him glance over his shoulder, and every phone call felt like it could bring bad news. Despite the pressure, Ethan found moments of unexpected warmth. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he shared dinner with Miriam and Isaiah. The meal was simple, vegetable soup and homemade bread, but it was the most fulfilling meal Ethan had eaten in years. This isn't just about the house, Miriam said quietly, breaking the silence. You've given us hope, Ethan. That's something we haven't felt in a long time. Isaiah grinned. And maybe you're learning to get your hands dirty, huh? Ethan laughed, shaking his head. I still have a long way to go. A week later, Karen called back. I've got something, she said. Marcus has been skimming from his tenants, charging illegal fees and underreporting his income on tax filings. It's not enough to send him to jail, but it's enough to hit him where it hurts. Ethan's lips curved into a grim smile. Good. Let's use it. He organized a town meeting, inviting tenants from across the area to share their experiences. Miriam spoke eloquently, her voice steady as she recounted the years of harassment and exploitation. Isaiah stood beside her, his presence a quiet testament to their resilience. The room buzzed with energy as others came forward, emboldened by the Coopers' courage. Stories of unfair evictions, skyrocketing fees, and underhanded tactics painted a damning picture of Marcus Reed. Ethan stood at the front of the room, addressing the crowd. We don't have to live under his shadow anymore. Together, we can fight back. The crowd erupted in applause, their collective anger transforming into determination. The next morning, Marcus showed up at the Cooper's house again, his face twisted with rage. "You're stirring up trouble, Carter," he growled. "You think you're untouchable, but you're not." Ethan stepped forward, his expression calm but steely. "The only trouble here is you, Marcus. And your time is up." Before Marcus could respond, a police car pulled up behind him. Two officers stepped out, one holding a folder of documents. "Marcus Reed," one of them said, "we need to talk about some discrepancies in your financial records." Marcus's face turned pale as he realized what was happening. He turned to glare at Ethan, but Ethan didn't flinch. "This isn't over," Marcus hissed before climbing into the police car. Ethan watched as the car drove away, a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time, it felt like they were winning. That evening, the Cooper's house was quiet, but filled with a sense of relief. Miriam leaned against the doorframe, watching the workers finish for the day. Isaiah turned to Ethan, a grin spreading across his face. "I think we did it, Mr. Carter." Ethan smiled back. "Not just me. All of us." But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The morning after Marcus Reed was escorted away by the police, a wave of cautious optimism swept through the town. Word of Marcus's downfall spread quickly, and people began to realize that his grip on their lives wasn't as unbreakable as they'd once thought. For the first time in years, tenants felt empowered to speak out. Ethan stood on the Cooper's porch, sipping coffee as he watched the workers repair the roof. The sounds of hammers and saws echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Isaiah stood beside him, his energy infectious. "Mr. Carter, we actually did it," Isaiah said, his voice brimming with excitement. Ethan smiled. "Call me Ethan, and we're not done yet. Taking Marcus down is just the first step. There's still a lot to fix." Isaiah tilted his head. "Like what?" Ethan gestured toward the rows of weathered houses that dotted the neighborhood. "These homes. The jobs people need. The community itself. Marcus was just a symptom of a bigger problem. We have to rebuild, not just houses, but trust and opportunity." Isaiah nodded thoughtfully, his eyes narrowing in determination. "Then let's do it." Later that day, Ethan gathered a group of local workers and community members for a meeting at the town hall. The turnout was better than he'd expected. Dozens of people packed the room, eager to hear what he had to say. Miriam stood near the front, her arms crossed and her expression one of cautious hope. Isaiah sat beside her, scribbling notes on a piece of paper. Ethan took a deep breath as he stepped up to the podium. "Thank you all for coming. I know that for a long time, this town has felt like it's been under the thumb of people like Marcus Reed. But things don't have to stay that way." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "We've started repairing the Cooper's home," Ethan continued. "But that's just the beginning. I've spoken to contractors and local businesses willing to pitch in, and we can start restoring more houses, one by one, until every family has a safe place to live." A hand shot up in the back of the room. It belonged to a young woman named Rachel, who managed the local grocery store. "That's great, but what about jobs? Fixing houses won't pay the bills." Ethan nodded. "You're right. That's why I'm also talking to investors who are interested in bringing new businesses to this town. We'll focus on creating opportunities, training programs, small business grants, and partnerships with local schools. It won't happen overnight, but we can make this a place where people can thrive." The room erupted in applause. Over the next week, Ethan threw himself into the work. He spent his days meeting with contractors, organizing supply deliveries, and coordinating with legal teams to dismantle Marcus Reed's network of shady deals. But he didn't do it alone. Isaiah proved to be an invaluable partner, spending every free moment helping with repairs and rallying his friends to volunteer. Miriam joined the effort as well, organizing meals for the workers and acting as a liaison between the community and Ethan's team. One afternoon, as they worked on a particularly dilapidated house, Isaiah looked up at Ethan and grinned. "You're getting pretty good at this, Ethan. I didn't think you'd stick around this long." Ethan chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. "Neither did I. But once you start something like this, you can't just walk away." Isaiah nodded. "I want to do this kind of stuff when I'm older, help people, make things better. Do you think I can?" Ethan crouched down to meet Isaiah's gaze. "I know you can. You've got the heart for it. And if you ever need help, you know where to find me." Not everyone was supportive of the changes, though. A small but vocal group of skeptics began to spread rumors that Ethan was using the town to boost his own image. One evening, while he was reviewing blueprints in the Cooper's kitchen, Miriam brought it up. "People are saying you're only doing this for publicity," she said, pouring him a cup of tea. Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I figured that might happen. It's hard to change the way people think overnight." Miriam sat across from him, her expression thoughtful. "You could prove them wrong." "How?" "By sticking with it," she said simply. "The longer you're here, the harder it'll be for anyone to doubt your intentions." Ethan nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're right. I'm not going anywhere." As the weeks went on, the repairs progressed rapidly. The Cooper's home was nearly complete, with a sturdy new roof, polished floors, and freshly painted walls. Other homes in the neighborhood were also undergoing transformations, and a sense of pride began to replace the despair that had long gripped the town. Ethan watched as the community started to come together in ways he hadn't expected. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now working side by side, sharing tools and stories. Children played in the newly cleared yards, their laughter echoing down the streets. One evening, as the sun set and the workers packed up for the day, Ethan stood on the Cooper's porch with Miriam. "Look at this place," Miriam said, her voice soft. "It feels alive again." Ethan followed her gaze, watching as Isaiah ran across the yard with a group of neighborhood kids. "It's not just the place. It's the people. They were always alive. They just needed a reason to hope." Miriam smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You've given us that, Ethan. I don't know how to thank you." Ethan shook his head. "You don't have to. This isn't about thanks. It's about doing what's right." Miriam looked at him for a long moment, then reached out and rested a hand on his arm. "Well, you've done right by us." As night fell, Ethan drove back to his own home, his mind racing with thoughts of what still needed to be done. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were more challenges to face, more battles to fight. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sound of hammers and drills through the neighborhood as Ethan parked his SUV outside the Cooper's newly transformed house. It was almost unrecognizable. The once sagging roof was now sturdy and covered with fresh shingles. The peeling paint had been replaced by a warm, welcoming shade of blue. Flowers lined the porch steps, planted by Isaiah and his friends. Miriam stood in the doorway, holding a steaming mug of coffee. She waved as Ethan approached. "Morning, Ethan," she said, her smile brighter than the sunlight filtering through the trees. "Morning," Ethan replied, stepping up to the porch. "How's it feel to have your house back?" Miriam took a sip of her coffee, her gaze sweeping across the neighborhood. "It feels unbelievable. Like maybe things really can change." Isaiah bounded out of the house, a grin plastered across his face. "Ethan, you've got to see the backyard. It's amazing." Ethan chuckled. "All right, lead the way." Isaiah guided him around the house to where a group of volunteers was putting the finishing touches on a small garden. Rows of vegetables were already sprouting, and a handmade wooden bench stood under the shade of an old oak tree. "We're going to grow our own food," Isaiah said proudly. "Mom says it'll help save money and teach me responsibility." Ethan nodded, impressed. "This is great, Isaiah. You did a good job." "Not just me," Isaiah said quickly. "Everyone helped. That's what made it work." Ethan smiled, feeling a swell of pride. This wasn't just about fixing houses anymore. It was about building a sense of community, one step at a time. As the day progressed, Ethan met with contractors and local leaders to discuss the next phase of their work. The repairs had sparked something larger. People were coming forward with ideas for improving the town, starting a co-op grocery store, renovating the old community center, and creating after-school programs for kids. Rachel, the grocery store manager, approached Ethan during a break. "You're really making a difference here, Ethan," she said. "But what happens when the work is done? Will you stay involved?" Ethan hesitated. The truth was, he hadn't thought that far ahead. His life in the city, his business, and his family all seemed so distant now. This project had consumed him, and he wasn't sure how to balance it with everything else. "I'll figure it out," he said finally. "I'm not walking away from this, Rachel. I promise." Later that evening, the Coopers hosted a small gathering at their home to celebrate the progress they'd made. Neighbors brought dishes of food, filling the dining table with a colorful array of casseroles, pies, and salads. The house buzzed with conversation and laughter. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with Miriam, watching as Isaiah shared jokes with a group of kids near the living room. "You know," Miriam said softly, "when my husband passed, I didn't think we'd ever feel this kind of happiness again. But now," she trailed off, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, "it's like we're part of something bigger, something that matters." Ethan looked at her, his throat tightening. "You're not just part of it, Miriam. You're the heart of it. This community, people like you and Isaiah, are the reason things are changing." Miriam reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." As the evening wound down, Ethan stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The stars were bright, scattered across the dark sky. He leaned against the porch railing, thinking about how much had changed in just a few short weeks. Footsteps approached, and he turned to see Isaiah standing beside him. "You okay, Ethan?" Isaiah asked. Ethan smiled. "Yeah, I'm good. Just thinking." Isaiah tilted his head, studying him. "About what?" "About what comes next," Ethan admitted. "There's still a lot to do." Isaiah nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that too. You know, when I grow up, I want to do what you're doing. Help people, make things better. I think that's what I'm supposed to do." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He placed a hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "You're already doing it, Isaiah, and I have no doubt you'll do even more." Isaiah grinned. "You think so?" "I know so," Ethan said firmly. The next morning, Ethan met with his assistant, Linda, who had come to the town to help coordinate the growing efforts. "You're in deep, Ethan," Linda said, flipping through a stack of reports. "This is a lot more than just fixing houses now." "I know," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. "But it feels right, Linda. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm doing something that matters." Linda smiled. "Well, if anyone can pull this off, it's you." As the day wore on, Ethan found himself standing in front of the old community center with a group of volunteers. The building was in worse shape than he'd realized. Broken windows, cracked walls, and a sagging roof. "We'll need more funds for this one," Rachel said, standing beside him. Ethan nodded. "We'll get it. One way or another, we'll get it done." He looked around at the group gathered behind him. These were people who had once been strangers, but now worked together with a shared sense of purpose. It was a new beginning, not just for the community, but for Ethan as well. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the town, Ethan felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. They were building something here, something real, something lasting, and he was ready to see it through. The Cooper's house was finally complete. The roof was secure, the walls freshly painted, and the yard alive with flowers and vegetables. The once crumbling structure now stood as a symbol of resilience and hope, not just for Miriam and Isaiah, but for the entire neighborhood. Ethan stood on the porch, taking it all in. The hum of activity filled the air as workers moved to the next project, restoring the community center. Children played in the street, their laughter mingling with the clatter of tools and the murmur of conversations. Miriam stepped out to join him, wiping her hands on her apron. "You've done something incredible here, Ethan," she said, her voice warm. "It's not just me," Ethan replied, smiling. "This is everyone's work. Yours, Isaiah's, the whole community." Miriam shook her head. "You were the one who believed it could happen. Without you, we'd still be where we were, stuck, scared, with no way out. Before Ethan could respond, Isaiah bounded up the steps, a grin splitting his face. "Mom, Ethan, you've got to come to the community center. They're putting up the new sign." When they arrived, a crowd had gathered around the front of the community center. The building still needed work, but the progress was unmistakable. The broken windows had been replaced, and the facade was clean and freshly painted. A crew was installing a wooden sign over the entrance, its bold letters reading, "Hope Community Center." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause as the sign was secured in place. Ethan found himself clapping alongside them, a lump rising in his throat. Rachel, the grocery store manager, approached with a wide smile. "The town's coming back to life, Ethan. It's like we're finally seeing what we're capable of." Ethan nodded. "This is just the beginning. There's still a lot to do, but now we know it's possible." The celebration continued into the evening, with neighbors gathering for a potluck in the center's newly cleared yard. Children played tag under the strings of lights that volunteers had hung between the trees. Laughter and music filled the air, blending into a warm symphony of togetherness. Miriam and Isaiah sat with Ethan at one of the tables, their plates piled high with homemade dishes. "I heard Marcus Reed's properties are being taken over by a management company," Miriam said, her tone cautious. "Do you think that'll make things better?" "It's a start," Ethan replied. "The new company is under close scrutiny, and I've already made sure there's a tenant advocacy group in place to hold them accountable." Miriam smiled. "You really thought of everything, didn't you?" Ethan shrugged. "I'm just doing what I can." Isaiah leaned forward, his eyes sparkling. "You've done more than that, Ethan. You've changed everything." As the night deepened, Ethan found himself standing on the edge of the gathering, watching the people he'd come to know and care for. These weren't just projects to him anymore. They were friends, neighbors, and partners in a shared vision of justice and equality. Sophia's voice echoed in his mind. "You can't save the world." Maybe not. But standing here, seeing the joy and hope radiating from this community, Ethan realized he didn't have to. Changing one corner of the world was enough to start something bigger. Isaiah joined him, his face thoughtful. "Hey, Ethan, I've been thinking, what's next?" Ethan smiled down at him. "Next? We keep going. We take everything we've built here and keep making it better. Not just here, but wherever it's needed." Isaiah nodded slowly, his expression determined. "Then I'm in. I want to help people, just like you." "You already are," Ethan said, clapping him on the shoulder. Months later, the changes were undeniable. The community center became a hub of activity, offering tutoring programs, job training, and spaces for art and music. The homes that had once been neglected were now vibrant and cared for, with families reclaiming a sense of pride and stability. Ethan's role shifted from leader to collaborator as the town began to run itself. Miriam took on a leadership role at the community center, while Isaiah became a voice for the youth, inspiring his peers to dream big and work together. One day, as Ethan prepared to leave for a meeting in the city, Isaiah approached him with a folder in hand. "What's this?" Ethan asked. Isaiah grinned. "Applications for law school. I want to fight for people the way you fought for us." Ethan felt a swell of pride as he flipped through the papers. "You're going to do great things, Isaiah. I'm sure of it." Isaiah smiled, his confidence shining through. "Because you showed me how." On Ethan's final evening in the town, the community gathered for a farewell dinner at the Cooper's home. The kitchen was filled with the smell of baked bread and roasted vegetables, and the dining table overflowed with food. Miriam raised her glass, her voice steady and heartfelt. "To Ethan Carter, who came to us as a stranger and left as a friend. You've shown us what's possible, and we'll never forget it." The room erupted in cheers and clinking glasses. Later, as the night wound down, Ethan stood on the porch with Miriam, watching the stars. "You've done something remarkable here," she said quietly. "So have you," Ethan replied. "This place isn't just better because of me. It's better because of you, because of everyone who believed in what we could build together." Miriam smiled, her eyes glistening. "We'll keep it going. I promise." Ethan nodded, knowing she would. As he drove away the next morning, the sun rising over the newly revitalized town, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had come here searching for a way to repay a simple act of kindness, but he was leaving with something far greater, a renewed sense of purpose and connection. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning, for the town, for Isaiah, and for Ethan himself.